Hello, this is Ernesto Amaral from the Sociology Department at Texas A&M University. Today, we're going to talk about instituting the Globalization project, all based on Chapter 4 of the textbook by Michael and Weber. As I mentioned before, you should read the chapter in the textbook to be able to complete the quizzes, because some specific information are not included in this lecture. At the same time, watching or reading this lecture is important for you to complete the perusal assignments that you have to interpret the material in chapter 4. So this is the overall structure of the chapter. We're going to discuss about neoclassical economics and neoliberalism, global market society, then the debt crisis and structural adjustment programs, organizing neoliberal development, and geopolitics and the globalization project. So the first topic, neoclassical economics and neoliberalism. Neoclassical economics emphasizes rational individual choices and market equilibrium as the foundation of economic behavior and efficiency. Neoliberalism holds that free markets with minimal government interference allocate resources more efficiently than state planning. So this is the core foundation of neoliberalism. Really minimal government interference. Markets are seen as self-correcting systems driven by supply, demand, and competition. Economic growth and efficiency are believed to follow naturally from deregulated markets. So really little government interference, and because with the idea that free markets, they are more efficient than the government and state planning. Individuals are viewed as rational actors aiming to maximize their own utility, and competitive markets are assumed to reward efficiency and innovation among participants. Society is framed as a collection of self-interested individuals, not collective groups. So it's all focused on the individuals and competition. Human welfare is thought to improve through competitive participation in the markets. And an important thing is related to the state role in global influence. Government policies that intervene in markets are considered inefficient and harmful. Public services are best managed through privatization or market-based mechanisms. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank promoted neoliberal reforms all over the world. And these reforms spread through loan conditions and debt of countries in the Global South. So countries in the Global South got loans, for example, from the IMF, and the IMF imposed some conditions in those countries. And the conditions were really related to neoliberal reforms, with a less government control that these countries should have on their economy. And overall, as is emphasized in the textbook, there is close correlation between debt, export liberalization, and deforestation. So here, for example, we have debt service as a percentage of export earnings back in the 1990s. And the countries with like darker shades here that have higher debt of export earnings back in 1990. And then you have the lower ones going from 0 to 9% until 40% or more. And then these ones here, high-income countries or data are not available, the ones in white. And then you see that usually countries with the darker shades of gray here, they have really high annual deforestation with data from 1990 and 1995. The smaller here with areas with like more than 1,000 square kilometers, and these ones with the darker circles with more than 10,000 square kilometers. So you see that countries with high debt of export earnings in percentage terms also have high annual deforestation, because they're just trying to export, and then they get a lot of debt, and that's related to deforestation of these countries, right? So that these countries getting loans from the IMF, for example, had this association with deforestation between 1990 and 1995. So this is the first topic of the chapter, giving an overview of neoliberalism. And the second part, we go to the debt crisis and the structural adjustment programs, SAPs. In the 1970s, developing countries borrowed heavily from global northern banks. Oil shocks led to rising interest rates and falling export earnings for these countries, for the developing countries. Many countries could no longer service their external debts in the 1980s because of these really increasing interest rates. So the developing countries could no longer afford paying their debts with the global northern banks. This debt crisis created pressure for intervention by global financial institutions. So this crisis opened the door to structural adjustment programs in the global south. And we're going to talk a little bit about these structural adjustment programs now. So what are the roots of these structural adjustment programs? They emerged in the 1980s with neoliberal ideology. They prioritize debt repayment and mark liberalization over social services. And these programs led to deep cuts in education, healthcare, and food subsidies. They were promoted by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank across the global south. And the structural adjustment programs aim to restore balance of payments and promote growth. Countries had to reduce public spending and remove subsidies to receive loans. Currency devaluation was often required to make exports more competitive. Trade liberalization policies were imposed to integrate economies into global markets. These reforms changed the economic structures of many developing countries. So these reforms had really strong influence on social change in these developing countries, which is how all this discussion is linked into our course. Trade liberalization exposed local farmers to international price volatility. Privatization reduced state control over key sectors, including water and energy. Currency devaluations increased the cost of imports, especially food and fuel. Job losses and wage stagnation were common outcomes of these reforms. And during this process, you also see the emergence of resistance movements. Protests erupted against austerity in countries like Mexico, India, and Ghana, for example. Civil society organizations challenged the legitimacy of imposed reforms. Alternative development models gained visibility through grassroots activism. Many communities emphasize food sovereignty and local knowledge systems. So trying to bring the communities, the power of communities back into the center in these countries. And this map here, available also in the textbook chapter, are locations of riots against these austerity programs, against these conditions imposed, for example, by the IMF for repayment of debts of developing countries. And here you have the number of austerity protests between 1976 and 1992. So in South America, you see a lot of protests going on in this period, but also in Mexico, in Central American countries, in Africa as well, Asia, and in Europe as well, in Eastern Europe. Cool. And this is another graph also available in the course textbook, the net transfers of long-term loans to third world states. Here you have positive transfers to third world up to 1983, and negative transfers from third world countries start in 1984. So you start to have these negative transfers of long-term loans from third world countries, and then showing that they have a lot of debts being paid to the global north banks. Privatization was promoted to reduce the role of state in economic affairs. State-owned enterprises were sold to private investors, often to foreign corporations. So foreign corporations start to have much more power in developing countries by owning these formerly state-owned companies. Advocates claim privatization would improve efficiency and lower public spending. Critics noted that the essential services became less accessible to poor populations because these foreign corporations did not care about the poor populations. Their main goal was to increase profit. Privatization helped shift economic power from states to multinational corporations. Privatization policies transfer public assets into private hands globally. These policies often led to reduced access to essential services for the poor. Public utilities like water and energy were commodified under neoliberal logic. Privatization reinforced global inequalities through wealth concentration. So you start to have much more wealth concentration and within countries and also between countries. So privatization led to this reduced access to essential services for the poor. And these inequalities, the inequality increased a lot all over the world and between countries as well. Neoliberal reforms enabled the rise of non-state actors in development, these new global actors. Private corporations and financial institutions gain influence in policymaking. Non-government organizations became involved in service provision and advocacy. The role of the state shifted towards regulation and facilitation of private interests. This change created a more fragmented and competitive global development arena. And the Bretton Woods institution is something important to highlight here. The Bretton Woods systems created institutions to stabilize the global economy, institutions that we already cited here. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, were established to support development and monetary stability all over the world. These institutions provided loans and promoted liberal economic policies worldwide. They became tools for implementing structural reforms in developing countries. The dollar became the global reserve currency under the Bretton Woods system. So you have this global monetary system being implemented. Fixed exchange rates aim to promote international trade and investment. The system supported US economic dominance and financial leadership. Eventually, the fixed exchange rate regime collapsed in the 1970s. And this is also a figure from the course textbook, select private foreign direct investment flows in the 1990s. So this is foreign direct investment in 1990 and 2004. So in Thailand, in Portugal, you have an increase throughout this period. Mexico, Japan, India, Brazil, and Argentina, for example, you see huge declines in these foreign direct investment flows. Right? And some government spending on foreign debt and social services. So countries that get loans, then they have to pay their debts. So the black columns here, the debt interest payments as a percentage of government revenue, really high, for example, in Brazil, Guatemala, and Madagascar. And the gray columns, the social services as percent of government expenditure. So you see in Brazil, a lot of money being used to pay foreign debt, and not as much to have social services available for the population. So the local population, the country population, doesn't receive as much resources as a percentage of the government expenditure as this money being used to pay foreign debt. And that's really clear in the case of Brazil. But also Madagascar, you see this huge difference in India as well, right? In Guatemala, the difference is also considerable there. And development aid started being used as a way to promote development in other countries. So you have these development aid programs. Foreign aid was used to promote development and political alliances. The US used aid to secure influence in newly decolonized nations. Aid often reinforced dependency rather than fostering self-sufficiency. Aid became a tool to promote market-based reforms and trade liberalization. And corporate investment, there is a focus on corporate investment. Private capital flows increased dramatically during the 1990s, exceeding official development aid. Global corporations shift production to regions with lower labor costs and fewer regulations. This shift aligned with structural adjustments favoring open markets and deregulation in the neoliberal framework that we talked before. Corporate-led development became central to globalization under neoliberal model. So all that process has really structural, important social changes in these developing countries. And it also influences changes in the developed countries as well. The market rule expansion. The market was treated as a self-regulated system, central to global economic policy. Governments were encouraged to reduce spending and limit regulation of business activities. This ideology promoted private enterprise over public sector responsibility in development. So a huge emphasis on privatization, as we talked before. It contributed to a growing influence of multinational corporations over national economies. So these multinational corporations, they purchasing previously state-owned companies, so they start to have more influence than national economies in developing countries. Foreign direct investment and speculative capital flows became key components of development. There's really huge association between investment and speculation. Speculation sometimes destabilized economies, as in the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. There was a reliance on global markets. The reliance on global markets made countries vulnerable to external economic shocks. Short-term gains were often prioritized over long-term development and equity. So these developing countries, they start to have a huge increase in inequality, in wealth inequality within these countries. The structural adjustment programs aim to stabilize economies through liberalization and privatization, as we talked before, in this neoliberal development framework. Governments were required to reduce public spending and open markets to foreign trade. The SAPs often led to social unrest due to reduced social services and rising inequality. These policies reflected a shift from national development to global market integration. And the SAPs diminished the state's roles in managing national development welfare. Social programs were cut, and public assets were often privatized to reduce debt. This shift aligned with neoliberal ideology, prioritizing market over state solutions. Developing nations face external pressure to adopt these changes despite local opposition. Neoliberalism gained global dominance by framing markets as the most efficient allocation system. Structural adjustment policies institutionalized neoliberal norms in the global south. So all this process being discussed throughout the chapter. Privatization and deregulation were justified as tools for increasing competitiveness and growth. Neoliberal hegemony shaped international development discourse and practice for decades. So you start to have the hegemony of this neoliberal policy. And you have this restructuration of the state. Neoliberalism redefined the state's role to support market efficiency. States were pressured to downsize public services and deregulate industries. Policy autonomy was undermined by global financial institutions. You see, governments prioritize debt repayment over public welfare investment. Political conditionality links financial aid to recipients' countries' adherence to specific government criteria. So these Western donors began using conditionality to promote liberal democratic reforms during the globalization era. So these banks, International Monetary Fund, for example, give loans to these countries, but then they impose a lot of conditions that these countries should follow. And the conditions are really related to these neoliberal reforms into their labor markets. The strategy increased leverage over policy decisions in the recipient global south countries. Aid conditionality was justified as a mechanism to promote stability and efficiency in governance. And we see also an impact on agriculture. Agriculture subsidies were removed, exposing farmers to volatile global prices. Cash crop production increased at the expense of food security and local needs. Rural populations were disproportionately affected by reduced support and services. Dependency on global markets is intensified, weakening national food sovereignty. Public sector downsizing led to increased unemployment and underemployment. So you start to see the labor and informal economy in the developing countries. Informal economies expanded as people sought alternative livelihoods outside regulation. Labor protections weakened, contributing to job insecurity and wage stagnation. Global competition pressured workers while reducing bargaining powers and rights. The group of seven, the seven industrialized countries, the richer countries, the coordinated economic policy among leading industrialized nations. It was formed to maintain global economic stability and capitalist dominance. Their policies promoted deregulation and trade liberalization worldwide. The G7 worked to manage global markets and address financial crises. So power shifted from national governments to international institutions and market actors. So you have these global governance shifts. Institutions like the World Trade Organization, WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, enforced neoliberal development standards. Democratic accountability was reduced as decisions were made by unelected global bodies, by these corporations. This shift raised concerns about sovereignty, justice, and representation in development, because developing countries were now being ruled by all these global bodies instead of themselves, like these institutions, and also by corporations. So the globalization project institutionalized market rule and private capital dominance. So you have this global market rule. Development was reframed as integration into global markets through liberalized policies. Inequality and instability grew in many regions under this market-centered framework. These trends set the stage for future critics and crises in the global development model. State control reduced throughout this process. Globalization reduced state control over domestic economic decisions in favor of the markets. Trade liberalization allowed transnational corporations to relocate production across borders. Export-led strategies encourage countries to focus on competitive advantage over local needs. Global commodity chains replace national industries and undermine local employment structures. The Group of Seven that we just mentioned before played a key role in initiating the globalization project. And the Group of Seven, just to make it clear, being Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It aimed to integrate markets through structural reforms and trade. They encourage a reduced role of state-led development strategies. Private capital and multinational corporations gain influence globally. And you have a new division of labor. Industrial production shifted to low-wage regions in the global south. This reorganization of labor was central to global economic restructuring. Countries adopted export-led growth to attract foreign investment. It created a new dependency on global commodity chains. And these transnational corporations expanded by integrating developing countries into global markets. They sought low-cost labor, tax incentives, and deregulated environments for profit maximization. Corporate investment increasingly bypassed state channels and influenced global governance. Power shifted from public institutions to private actors, shaping economic and social outcomes. And you have a decline of the import substitution industrialization, ISI. The import substitution industrialization strategies lost traction with that and trade liberalization. Governments face pressure to reduce subsidies and open markets to global competition. Loss of protection exposed domestic industries to foreign dominance and job losses. The shift to neoliberalism favored export orientation and minimal state intervention. And you have this new liberal policy shift. Neoliberalism emerged in the 1980s as a shift from state-led development to market-driven policy, as we have been talking about since the beginning of this chapter. It emphasized deregulation, privatization, and reduced government intervention in the economy. Global institutions promoted neoliberal reforms as essential for integration in the world economy. These changes were presented as necessary for development and modernization. Neoliberalism prioritized global markets access over domestic needs and equity considerations. So you have this market-led global integration. It encouraged free trade agreements and removal of trade barriers between nations. Countries were urged to specialize based on comparative advantage for global competitiveness. This approach often disadvantages poorer nations with weaker industrial bases. So the industry is the manufacturer would be based more in the richer countries. The Washington Consensus summarized key neoliberal reforms promoted by global financial institutions. Policies included fiscal discipline, tax reform, trade liberalization, and investment deregulation. These policies shaped structural adjustment programs and conditional lending practices. Critics argue that these reforms undermine national sovereignty and widen inequality across countries. And you also have these green neoliberal strategies. Green neoliberal promotes market mechanisms to address environmental problems. These strategies include carbon trading and payments for ecosystem services. Corporate actors play a central role in these market-based conservation efforts. Critics argue this approach commodifies nature rather than addressing root issues. So they commodify nature, but they don't actually address root issues that are increasing inequality across countries, within countries, and between countries. Multi-stakeholder governance includes governments, businesses, and civil society. It emphasizes collaboration in policymaking and global environmental decisions. This model reflects shifts away from nation-state-centered global governance. Critics highlight power imbalances between actors in these kind of arrangements, putting a lot of power on the hands of businesses, and national governments and civil society losing power on the policy-making decisions. In terms of sustainability and governance, sustainability narratives increasingly shaped global development agendas through environmental discourses. Governments adopted frameworks integrating economic, environmental, and social goals under global institutions. The shift involved broader coalitions, including civil society, business, and international agencies. This evolution introduced governance models aiming to balance growth and ecological limits. Neoliberalism adapted to sustainability by commodifying environmental services and resources, as mentioned before. Markets for emission trading and green products were integrated into economic development models. Environmental concerns were reframed as investment opportunities and market-based initiatives. This market logic risks sidelining local environmental justice and indigenous rights. So what are some of the critics of green neoliberalism? Critics argue green neoliberalism reinforces inequality and erodes democratic control of resources because they don't look at the root of the social problems, at the real causes of social problems. It often prioritizes profit over genuine ecological restoration or social equity outcomes. So that's what neoliberalism does. Green technologies and markets can mask exploitative supply chains and carbon-intensive dependencies. Sustainable development must reconcile global environment goals with grassroots democratic movements. They're actually doing genuine ecological restoration. So, which is something that the neoliberalism is not doing, because the green neoliberalism reinforces inequalities. It doesn't actually go into reconciling global environmental goals with grassroots democratic movements. So that was the second part of this chapter. The third part is about geopolitics and the globalization project. The globalization project restructured world economies around liberal trade principles. It reduced national policy space and weakened public control over economic direction. Governance shifted from development goals to market-driven outcomes and deregulation, as we have been emphasizing. Social resistance began forming around the failures of the globalization policies. So trade agreements and policy. Trade agreements helped liberalize markets and facilitate global capital flows. Liberalization reduced protectionist barriers and increased reliance on export production. Policies favored multinational corporations and export-oriented industries. They shifted economic control from national governments to global institutions. So in terms of the role of the World Trade Organization and global integration, the WTO replaced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, to enforce trade rules among nations. It expanded the scope of global trade to include services and intellectual property. Dispute resolution became binding, enhancing compliance with global trade norms. Critics argue it undermines national sovereignty and promotes inequality. The Uruguay round outcomes. The Uruguay round further deregulated trade and expanded global markets. It required countries to reduce subsidies and open agricultural markets. This favored industrialized nations and marginalized small farmers globally. The agreement institutionalized trade liberalization through WTO enforcement. The WTO project formalized global trade rules favoring corporate interests. Trade liberalization created pressures for nations to dismantle protective policies. WTO agreements limited governments' ability to support key industries or regulate imports. Developing countries often face challenges adjusting to the competitive global trade system. The WTO and market access. The WTO enforces trade liberalization through rules favoring open markets, deregulation. Market access policies reduce tariffs and barriers, pushing countries towards global competition. WTO disciplines countries resisting privatization or favoring domestic industries. Trade rules are shaped by powerful states and corporations influencing global trade norms. The trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS agreement under the WTO, sets global standards for intellectual property rights. So these TRIPS and the association with intellectual property rights. TRIPS prioritize corporate rights over public health, impacting access to essential medicines. So it's all related to property rights, putting a lot of power on corporate rights and less on public health. So essential medicines, they actually are thought to give profit to these corporations instead of promoting the health of the public. There is a switch in how health should be gone throughout the world. Developing nations face constraints on innovation due to rigid IP enforcement. Global South countries have protested TRIPS as a barrier to development and self-reliance. So TRIPS and policy limits. The TRIPS agreement enforced patent protection across the developing world. It reduced access to affordable medicine and restricted domestic innovation policies. So that's really bad for public health in these developing countries. Countries lost control over public health and agricultural technologies due to TRIPS, due to this agreement. development strategies were undermined by intellectual property enforcement regimes. So some of the criticisms of WTO governance. WTO processes lack transparency and favor powerful nations in decision making. Global civil society protests the WTO's undemocratic and neoliberal policies. One example is the 1999 Seattle protests symbolized widespread discontent with globalization's direction. Critics argue WTO promotes corporate interests over social and environmental justice. The WTO formalized trade liberalization policies through binding international agreements. So there is this global governance shift. The shift from state sovereignty to global governance was led by trade institutions. Market access became prioritized over development-oriented national policy autonomy. So you have this market access and this global governance instead of a national policy autonomy. Global governance mechanisms expanded transnational corporate influence over policy. So WTA's role and impact. The WTO enforced uniform trade rules and settled international disputes effectively. It expanded beyond goods to cover services, agriculture, and intellectual property. It went all different areas of economy, of our society. WTO agreements constrain national governments' policy flexibility for development. This led to greater dependency on international market forces and investors, having really strong influences on social change. The WTO and trade liberalization pushed countries toward open markets and deregulation. National economies were integrated into global market, often on unequal terms. You have this trade and global integration. Trade agreements prioritize corporate interests over labor, environment, and local needs. Export-led growth became a central strategy, exposing countries to global market volatility. So in terms of debt and economic discipline, debt became a powerful mechanism for imposing economic discipline in the global south. IMF and World Bank loans were conditional on austerity measures and policy reforms, imposing new liberal strategies to the global south. These measures prioritize debt repayment over social spending or national development, such as in the figure that we saw. For example, Brazil spending a lot for debt repayment compared to social spending. Countries lost economic sovereignty under the pressure of international debt servicing. So debt and dependency, developing countries became increasingly dependent on external loans and aid. Debt repayments limited governments' ability to fund public investments. Global creditors gain influence over national economic policies. So all in this globalization process, everything having really impact on how societies are organized, having really strong effect on social change in those countries. Economic sovereignty eroded under pressure from financial institutions. Reforms prioritize debt repayment over poverty alleviation or social equity. In terms of financialization of food aid programs became increasingly tied to global financial markets and trade. Commodities were used to manage surplus production and influence international relations. Financialization linked food aid to debt and dependency in recipient countries. This practice served geopolitical goals more than humanitarian purposes. There is a shift in rural economies. Rural areas were restructured to support export-oriented agriculture systems. Traditional subsistence farming declined under pressure from global market forces. So you have all these changes in rural economies as well. This transition led to rural unemployment and migration to urban centers. Agro-export models created vulnerabilities to global commodity price fluctuations. Small farmers and peasants organized to resist marginalization and land losses. So you start to have these resistance movements. Movements challenge development models that prioritize large-scale agribusinesses. They advocated for food sovereignty and sustainable agricultural practices. These struggles highlighted contradictions within the development project. So there is reordering of global priorities. The structural adjustment reoriented economies toward export production and foreign investment. Policies discouraged domestic spending on health, education, and social welfare programs, as we show in the previous figure. Global institutions promoted neoliberal reforms as pathways to growth and stability. National development goals were subordinated to global market integration. In terms of effects on social welfare, budget cuts undermined public services and increased reliance on private provision. Healthcare and education became less accessible to marginalized populations. Inequality grew as benefits of growth accrued to elites and investors. So a lot of the growth, a lot of the resources were just going to elites and investors as profits. And social inequality grew within countries and between countries. Social unrest intensified in many countries due to deteriorating living conditions. And in this process, the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, were aimed at addressing global poverty through a set of measurable targets. Critics argue MDGs depolitized development and overlooked the structural causes of poverty. The MDGs reinforced neoliberal logic while shifting attention to individual country accountability. And so they actually overlooked the structural causes of poverty, not really looking what were the main causes of inequality, and shift attention to individual countries' accountability. So some of the critique of MDGs, the MDGs focuses heavily on outcomes without addressing root global inequalities. Implementation often relied on private-public partnerships and market-based solutions. They overlooked the impact of international institutions and global power asymmetries. The MDGs continue the legacy of the Globalization project under humanitarian guise. And related to that, we see the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations introduced the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, to replace the Millennium Development Goals. These goals aim to integrate environmental, social, and economic objectives. There is an emphasis on inclusive, equitable development that protects ecosystems. Implementation still largely depends on global institutions and funding structures. So in the transitions to the SDGs replaced MDGs in 2015 with broader objectives, trying to deal with these, the main roots of inequality. SDGs aim to integrate development with environmental and social sustainability goals. Despite this shift, the SDGs still reflect global governance influenced by neoliberal interests. The SDGs continue to emphasize economic growth as a central pathway to development. So this was the final part of this chapter. A summary here of this chapter. The globalization project institutionalized neoliberal principles through the SAPs and trade liberalization, as we discussed. That crisis pushed many countries to adopt austerity and open markets to global capital. Institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO reshaped state roles in favor of privatization, having strong influence on social changes in developing countries. Global inequalities and social dislocations emerged from structural adjustment and market reforms. So these structural adjustment programs had a lot of influence on global inequalities and social dislocations, having really strong influences on social changes all over the world. So some questions for reflection that help you also do the assignments for this course. How did that and the structural adjustment programs redefine national sovereignty in the global South? What role did international institutions play in promoting neoliberal globalization? In what ways did the WTO shape global trade rules in favor of powerful states? How did structural adjustment affect social services and public welfare in developing countries? And finally, here some selected websites that are listed at the end of the textbook chapter. The Public Citizen Global Trade Watch, an American website, Structural Adjustment Participatory Review International Network, the UN Capital Development Fund, the World Health Organization, WHO, and the World Trade Organization, the website for each one of them. So thank you very much. This was another lecture related to our course, Social Change. Thank you very much for your attention.